Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to give you a perspective from Wall Street on sort of all of what's being discussed. I'll preface it by saying I can be empathetic with anyone in the audience from Covance or LabCorp, as my title slide is actually now antiquated. We were acquired a few weeks ago, and that was completed on Monday by a company called Evercore. So this is probably the last presentation of this style I'll be giving, but their colors, luckily, are at least very similar to ours, so we'll just put a little E in front of the ISI. So just in terms of the talk, I'll just give a quick introduction of myself and what I do, since I'm probably not someone you interact with on a regular basis. We'll talk a little bit about the pharma industry and biotech and what's going on. We'll talk a bit about the CROs, and then we'll leave some time for questions. So this is actually pretty timely. Someone asked me this before. What is someone from Wall Street doing at the PCT conference? Yeah, pretty good question. So I obviously look over many different healthcare subsectors, of which one is the CROs. I also work with my other partner on the pharma biotech industry, and so we have sort of a formalized view for the investment community, but also folks at many of the companies you work for on sort of how to invest and how to navigate the many industries we touch. A couple of things to preface before I sort of give the talk. I am just a sell-side analyst. I may have been doing this for a long time, but I've never worked at a pharma company or a CRO, so you'll have to remember that as you ask me questions. I have someone who has an MD license in the United States, but he never practiced. I don't have any letters after my degree, so I'm not a scientific individual by trade, although I've been around this industry long enough, I can use most of the vernacular pretty well. So I am a finance guy, and I'm not capable of giving you advice on how to do your job better, but I can give you a pretty good perspective about how folks like myself view your companies as well as the industry. So in terms of the pharma market, so if we had the chart up on the top, what it would basically have said is that pharma has actually had a pretty good renaissance over the last 5 years, and it's really a function of the fact that pipeline success has been up. There's a greater confidence in the fact that investors will be redeploying the great cash flow that pharma generates from these drugs back into the pipeline, as well as being returned to the shareholders for investment. And then you've also had a huge success rate on the biotech side. I mean, biotech has been a massive outperformer in the market. Some of that is the fact that we've got very low interest rates, and that allows people to take greater risk. But we've also, again, had tons of development in a lot of interesting areas of the therapeutic realm. More recently, things like Hep C, et cetera, have generated fantastic amounts of value. And so that has really created a lot of enthusiasm in the public markets about many of the companies that all of us sort of look at. So the key things are R&D productivity is improving, so whatever you guys are doing on a daily basis is actually having real-life results, and that is creating value for many, many people. We do have a rise in NMEs, which is very good. Some new therapies have become household names. So again, I talked about Sovaldi. We've also got Harvoni, which is now, you've got Tecfidera, you've got the PD-1s, you've got Vertex's key drug. And so it's been a very good run the last 2 or so years, and that's really led to kind of an explosion in the context of biotech IPOs, where you've had a lot of money being put toward experimental therapies. So moving on here, but things aren't perfect, right? And so Ariad had a very public issue with a drug last year that was pulled from market. You've had a ton of commentary from the PBMs, which in the US is the pharmacy benefit managers, so that's Express Scripts and Caremark and United Health, the insurers, which I know you talked about on the reimbursement side. They've basically tried to create a pricing war. We'll see what happens when AbbVie brings their therapy to market, but that's a huge pain point for the consumer in the US. The government has scrutinized a lot of these inversion transactions, AbbVie Shire being the most recent that ended up in that not being consummated. The payers had been an uproar in general around around drug inflation. That's also, frankly, not just true for branded pharmaceuticals, but more recently for generic drugs. Generic drugs actually, after, I don't know, 10, 15 years of seeing deflation, have actually now moved to an inflationary environment. So that's kind of interesting. Some of it is the entire basket inflating, but some of it's examples like Calor and levothyroxine seeing multi-1,000% type increases. And that's starting to draw the ire of the regulators. There's been a huge push again from the insurers on what they call formulary exclusions, and they've tried to use that as a means to control pricing. We've seen that recently show up in categories like diabetes, et cetera, but they'll try to do it in even more progressive states like MS and in potentially Hep C. Immuno-oncology has become very competitive. That's a big change. Biosimilars, which are kind of an interesting topic, they're starting to become more of a reality. Part of my thought of why reimbursement experts and insurers in the U.S. are getting more aggressive with formulary exclusions is I believe they're trying to prepare for the fact that biosimilars will come to the U.S. and potentially give you some relief on high-cost drugs like Neupogen and Neulasta or Aranesp or Epogen or the TNFs. And then you've also got, some patent cliff questions that start to come about. Gilead, which is now a $170 billion company, has a number of key drugs that people will argue are either factored or not factored in to their, valuations. And so you're seeing, again, after what was a very bad period in the sort of early 2000s for the pharma folks relative to valuations, as everyone was sort of staring at this generic cliff. We have now gone through the generic cliff, but now after several years of good times, you're seeing people again frightened that maybe pipelines at some point again, particularly on the biotech side, kind of slow down. But the good news is, and this was a debate earlier in the year, we're probably not in the midst of a biotech bubble despite all the fundraising and excitement, and so at least that is sort of a moderate sort of positive. So what are drug investors in general most focused on? So while it's become more competitive, immuno-oncology has been a very hot therapeutic area. The biggest trial of the year was the Bristol-Myers trial, at least in terms of investor interest. You've also had a huge shift change to remethylating therapies, huge focus. Holy grail of MS would be Biogen's drug. That's been an interesting new category. Despite all the, I guess you can call them failures or challenges, Alzheimer's remains a key focus area, and obviously for Lilly, the SOLA data, which is possible maybe next year, at least in our mind, is something that will be of great interest. Looking at LDLs is back, so while that was an interesting play a number of years ago, there's a number of new ways to sort of look at that, and so that's kind of interesting. And then, again, HCV is going to be a huge battleground in our world, and everyone's sort of awaiting ultimately what the folks at AbbVie will do. So in terms of the CROs, which are a slightly different animal, you've really seen some divergence in demand and performance. Demand's been mixed. The better part of the universe has been more of what many of the folks here look at, which would be what we call late stage growth. Early phase, which would really be animal-based or discovery-based work, has been pretty choppy. It's been improving as of late, but there's been many issues there with capacity utilization concerns. There's just a massive amount of available capacity globally in that market, and so pricing has been depressed. What's interesting is if you cut it sort of pre-recession, so pre-08 and post-08, it's really a different world for the space. Pre-08, you had huge growth. You had the functional model kind of as the primary option, and you also had a very healthy early phase market. A lot of that was biotech driven, and there was a view that a lot of discovery was going to be shifted out to Charles River and Covance and the like, and that sort of never really manifested itself. 08 was pretty hard from an R&D growth perspective. It sort of coincided with the generic wave, and so we saw a pretty big dip. But we're seeing things kind of recover in many of the different parts. R&D growth is probably now low single digits across the industry. outsourcing penetration is on the rise, given some of the strategic transactions that have happened. And so you're seeing sort of a recovery of growth. Just on the R&D side, I think if you would cut into it a little more, pharma, big pharma in and of itself is probably growing R&D in the very, very low singles, and biotech probably in the high singles to low doubles. So it's still quite a bit biased, but I would say in general, pharma is probably healthier than it's been in some time. Another sort of interesting thing in our world is private equity. They've had a great interest in the space. PPD, which some of you may work for, was kind of the last large sizable transaction that was a Carlyle-backed deal that has gone quite well. I actually spoke to the CEO the other day. It seems like momentum in the business has been quite good. And then on the flip side of that, two companies, Quintiles obviously came back to the public markets last year. It's been a very successful IPO, but actually two companies, and I can talk about this because we're not involved with the issues, but PRA and Inc. Research are both coming back to the public markets, frankly, now. I think PRA is on the road as we speak, and so that'll be sort of interesting to see how those deals price. But certainly, investor interest in the space is elevated versus the last several years. And so, while there's some puts and takes, those who are kind of winners overall are getting rewarded. So in terms of, again, just cutting a little bit into the numbers, you could see the chart here on the far left, back when we went to the early 2000s, R&D growth in general was quite robust, almost in the sort of low double digits in teens range, and that sort of came down through the generic wave and then is kind of flattened out here after going negative briefly during the recession in sort of this 3-ish% range. And we think that that's probably going to be quite true for some time. So not a massive recovery, but I think we have kind of at least leveled off here at a good level. And given the dollar amounts, we're talking north of 120 billion globally spent on drug development. That's probably not a bad thing. Bottom left here, we're looking at sort of outsourcing penetration by function, which I thought was kind of interesting. Overall, we think work done by the CRO industry for pharma and biotech is somewhere in the high 30 to low 40% range. As you can see, central lab is the most outsourced function. It's sort of interesting. Maybe we'll conclude with it, but that's certainly a big part of the LabCorp Covance deal, where Covance is clearly one of the preeminent central labs, but it is a very penetrated market. You can see phase 3, which is, from a dollar perspective, quite important, but actually somewhat underpenetrated in the 30s. Phase 1 actually quite penetrated in sort of the 50% range. And then you could see preclinical, which would a lot of it be tox, kind of in the 40% range, and then discovery, which is sort of a lot of the new work around biomarkers and the like. That's still very much kept in-house by a lot of the pharma. And again, on the right here, you can see some of the PE transactions of the last few years. If you just think about how things work in that world, usually things come in waves. A sector goes out of favor, like the CROs were during the period where R&D growth was kind of crashing in sort of the mid-2000s. PE steps in, looks at an undervalued asset, tries to optimize it, usually does some M&A, which is what Inventive and the folks at Inc., you could see with Kendall and the like, did. And then ultimately they try to then bring that asset back to market, which is what you're seeing right now. On the early phase side, which is something that's probably of less interest to this audience, but sort of interesting in general, there's been a number of different headwinds in that space, as I sort of stated earlier. There's been a lot of facility closures across the board to try to deal with this, both on the pharma side as well as across the preclinical CROs, but we're still not seeing sort of demand and supply brought back to homeostasis. There's still, frankly, a lot to do on the biopharma side, but a lot of the inefficiencies, frankly, exist here in Europe, and so those are difficult facilities to close or to shift. The pricing environment, while stable, is still at fairly depressed levels, relative to at least pre-crisis. To give you an example, someone like Covance or Charles River ran at about a 25% operating profit margin pre-crisis in this business, and today they're running somewhere in the 10 to 15% range. So pricing is down considerably, and we don't see much need for that, unfortunately, to move higher. But you would need basically capacity utilization to get to, in these facilities, I don't know, north of 85%, and today they're probably sub 70, and so we're still a while away. We've seen a major shift away from GLP to non-GLP tox studies. That's had some implications for growth and visibility as well. A lot of the non-GLP stuff is cheaper, smaller, and that's kind of contributed to some of the limited visibility. It's interesting to the prior talk, VC funding for early stage biotech, who obviously pursue a virtual model a lot of the times, remains a little bit below trend. Although if you sort of layer on some of the public market activity, it's actually been much healthier the last 2 years. That's usually a pretty good leading indicator for at least that type of work for the CRO. Is obviously you get the money and then you need to in turn spend it. But we'll see with this last cycle of biotech fundraising how long that takes, or how much the capital is kind of hoarded versus used, just because everyone, again, remembers the challenges of sort of 08 and 09 in terms of capital access. And so, while that's probably, hopefully not going to happen again, it does beg the question of how quickly you kind of burn your cash, et cetera. And then lastly, as I said before, in genomics, in translational medicine, and other parts of discovery, there's still a lot more opportunities for the CRO. But again, a lot of this is stuff that is viewed as highly valuable in this, kept in-house. Again, I guess we're missing a couple of the charts here, but what this would have had was basically some of the different metrics we look at. As you can see on the right here, venture funding has kind of been mixed, as I said before, for biotech, although on the public market side it's been quite better. We also spent a lot of time looking at book-to-bills in the space, and in terms of the CROs on the late phase side, that's really been biased to some of the larger organizations. The strategic outsourcing model has really done a lot for the large players like Quintiles and PPD and Icon and Parexel, et cetera. You can see here some on the bottom right, some of the facility closures that I talked about before. In terms of the late phase folks, as we look at it, strategic partnerships have been a huge boon to a lot of those players, and it's really yielded a outlook for those CROs that is markedly better than the early phase guys. There's been a lot of acceleration of late phase pipeline, a lot of focus on phase 3 and getting into the clinic, and that's really been a bit at the expense of preclinical. The book-to-bills, which I talked about before, which have ran kind of 1.2 to 1.3 for the industry, kind of point to high single to almost low double-digit growth over the medium term. They've actually been coming down a bit more recently. It's a phenomenon we're trying to sort out, so if you can help me offline, I'd be quite curious. But for a while, we've seen quite good demand and a lot of trial starts, and phase 3 in general has been quite a good place to be. As I said before, the momentum of the strategic partnerships has done a lot to really benefit the large providers. We've seen, I think we had a gentleman from Takeda before, there was Bayer yesterday, and a few others who have been really preeminent on vendor consolidation, moving from many CROs to one or two or maybe a small group. That's been a huge benefit, obviously, to the larger players who are typically disproportionately winners in that scenario. But there hasn't always been necessarily an improvement in actually profit growth to go with some of these events, as we saw with Icon and Parexel as they onboarded Pfizer. While Pfizer has been a huge win for both of those companies from a profit perspective in the early phases, it was actually quite a drag. And so, as a lot of the transition studies happened and a lot of business was moved over from Pfizer's legacy partners, that obviously was a fairly big drag on the P&L, although that's kind of unwound itself a bit over the last several quarters, as now we've gotten back to more of a run rate for those businesses. Central Lab continues to be a business that's faced a mix of sort of higher value tests, but also increased cancellation, so it's been a bit choppy. Most of the growth there, at least on the Covance side, has come from what appears to be share gains, so they're doing well versus the industry. But with the market kind of 80% outsourced, there's a lot of questions on what growth will look like in that business. And again, that's a high fixed cost business, so in our world, that usually means higher degree of profit and earnings volatility. So again, we're missing a couple charts, but the bottom right shows some of the strategic partnerships that at least have been publicly announced that we've focused on. Some of the major ones were obviously Eli Lilly and Covance, and Sanofi and Covance, and you've also seen Lilly partner with a few other of the CROs. Takeda before talked about their two partners, of which Covance is one, and we've seen Astellas and Inc. and many more. But we would expect these type of multi-year long-term relationships to frankly be a greater trend in industry. It's beneficial, we've seen, at least to both parties, certainly from a financial standpoint, although I guess everyone here could probably debate the merits of it strategically. I know someone earlier, I believe from Amgen, was talking about FSP still being a great option depending on the organization. So it certainly does depend on what your needs are, but certainly from our standpoint, longer term deals with greater cost saves and more visibility is always good financially. And here again, you can see kind of the book to bills, which have been in a generally positive trend, although as I said, if this extended through the most recent quarters, it would be a little bit choppier. So that's it. I will sort of, since I have a little bit extra time, kind of opine on something that happened earlier in the week in terms of Covance and LabCorp, which is kind of an interesting transformational deal, frankly, for this industry. We cover both companies. I know Joe Herring and Dave King quite well. And so this is sort of interesting in the fact that it's not a typical deal that we see. And normally you'd see two businesses within the same industry get together, and then there's all sorts of cost savings and synergies and the like. This is really sort of a bet on the clinical lab side that moving away from the managed care organizations in the U.S., which predominantly pay for a lot of the clinical lab work, to the pharma companies and biotech, which is the primary customer, obviously, of Covance, is a major move in the right direction. And frankly, it's a move to diversify away from low growth in the clinical lab space to the high growth CRO industry. And so, they paid a pretty hefty amount of money to do that. About, in our world, about 13 times EBITDA, which is sort of a proxy for cash flow, I guess, in a more simple sense. But a fairly heavy multiple on profits to basically get access to Covance's tremendous central lab and then their late phase and early phase capabilities. I think the kind of interesting aspects of the deal, and we've heard it talked about a lot over the course of this conference, is sort of, what can you do with big data? I mean, I know that was a huge focus of Covance, that was a huge focus of LabCorp. So together, they're obviously going to try to sort out how to use all of that massive amounts of data they have to improve trial recruitment and speed up delivery of trials. And so we'll have to see how they differentiate themselves in doing so versus the peers, because I know this is also a major focus of Quintiles and many of the others. The other thing I think that's kind of interesting, and we've heard a lot about genomics and the impact of maybe companion diagnostics, et cetera. LabCorp is a real competency there. They will try to bring that to the Covance team, although Covance did sell them the Rosetta business a few years ago. LabCorp has a lot more experience in LDTs and the like, and so I would say that it will be quite interesting to see how they bring those diagnostic capabilities ultimately to the pharma base and try to accelerate adoption of things of that sort. I would say the last comment I have on that, and then we can see if there's any questions in the audience, but what's interesting is, again, sort of the lack of overlap typically means an easier integration. So from a customer standpoint, that's good. But from a financial community standpoint, again, the financial targets that will have to be hit here will be quite significant. And so that's probably going to be more of a revenue question. And so we'll have to see whether or not putting these two organizations together ultimately yields share gain and an accelerated growth. And that's really going to be probably how that transaction is ultimately judged. But given the leaders kind of involved, we're quite optimistic long term that they will make it work. But we're also interested to see what some of the other large peers like Quest Diagnostics, which is the other big lab in the U.S., does. Do they buy another CRO and try to move into this industry? And then what do the other market leaders in the CRO space do as a response? Quintiles and Parexel and Icon and PRA and the like. How do they sort it out, and what does this industry look like in several years? So that's all I have in terms of prepared remarks. I know we maybe have a few quick minutes for questions, but I'm happy to sort of answer anything pertinent.
Ross, since you cover both biotech, pharma, and CROs, if I have $100, where should I invest in this stock? Pharma, biotech, or CRO? What is your recommendation?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, it's always sort of dependent on what you want, right? So the pharma companies obviously offer typically much better income, right? So good dividends, stable growth. Our biotech pharma analyst really very much likes Pfizer. And a number of others, but there you're getting much more of a yield or income play. And if you consider the fact that someone like AbbVie has a 5% dividend yield, pretty stable business, versus U.S. Treasuries or German Bunds, which are yielding very, very low single digits, that's actually quite a good trade for someone who's looking for, in their post-retirement years, some income generation. Biotech is very much a world of risk, right, as you talked about. And so, in my mind, if I'm going to take on risk, I want a reasonably good reward. There are, sort of, depending on how you see the Hep C markets, inexpensive names like Gilead, which could be something to contemplate. But a lot of the money, frankly, is made in things kind of in the earlier phases. And if you can sort out the next Pharmaset or Regeneron or the like, and avoid sort of the Ariads and folks that have issues, you can do reasonably well. And on the CRO side, it's actually, frankly, a mix of growth and income. I mean, you've got folks like Quintiles who have quite good cash flow and have returned a lot of that capital, but also have reasonably good growth. And you have Parexel as well, which is an Icon, which have done quite well in terms of top line growth. And so, it really very much depends stylistically on what your preference is and what your risk tolerance is. But frankly, across the different spaces, we think all in, they're pretty good places to be. If you think conceptually about the U.S., healthcare as a percentage of GDP needs to come lower. And so to do that, there's going to be a lot more price compression and threat to areas that lack innovation. And the good news is this area has a lot of innovation. There's a lot of other parts of the healthcare continuum that probably are sitting on margins that aren't sustainable or lack innovation to be able to sustain those margins or value. And so this is actually, in terms of a complex, a pretty good place to put your money, just in the face that the underlying drivers are good. And while reimbursement is certainly a risk and a threat, comparative to other places like med devices, et cetera, where you have 20-year-old devices that are still sold at massive amounts of premium and there's no real generic comparison, those are areas, frankly, we're much more concerned about longer term than this complex. Great. Thank you very much.